The house felt too quiet. The ranch felt too large. Everything reminded her of him. His boots still sat by the door. His jacket still hung on the hook. Every corner of the home carried a memory she wasn't ready to face. Outside the window, the land stretched far into the distance, golden and open. But instead of bringing her peace, it made her feel small and alone. She had always worked beside Michael. They had run the ranch together, shared the chores, shared the plans, shared the dreams. Without him, the ranch looked like a task too big for one person. She tried to distract herself with work, but even that brought pain. When she went to the barn, she could still hear his laugh echoing between the wooden walls. When she fed the horses, she remembered how he used to hum a tune while doing the same. When she walked by the gate, she imagined him leaning on it, waving at her, like he always did. Every memory felt like a hand pulling her backward. Friends visited often in those first few days. They brought food, offered help, and spoke soft words meant to comfort her. But the more they tried to ease her grief, the more she felt it press on her chest. She appreciated their kindness, but none of them were Michael. None of them understood the exact shape of her loss. The worst part was not the silence, it was the emptiness beside her, the space where he used to stand. But there was one face she had not expected to see again. On the afternoon before the funeral, when the sun sat low and warm, a truck rolled up the dirt road toward her house. At first, she assumed it was another neighbor. But as the truck came closer, she recognized the worn brown hat, the faded denim jacket, and the tall figure behind the wheel. Her heart tightened. Caleb Riker. She hadn't seen him in years. He stepped out slowly, as if unsure whether he should be there. His eyes held the same calm steadiness she remembered, though his face had grown more weathered with time. Caroline felt a strange mix of surprise and something deeper, something she couldn't name. Caleb removed his hat and held it in his hands. "Caroline," he said quietly, "I heard about Michael. I came as soon as I could." For a long moment, she couldn't speak. She only stared at him, trying to understand why seeing him felt like opening a door to an old part of her life she thought she had locked away. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you for coming," she finally said. He nodded, keeping his eyes on her carefully, as if afraid to cause more pain. "Your husband was a good man. I'm real sorry." Caroline looked down at her hands. "It still doesn't feel real." Caleb took a slow breath, glancing toward the barn, the fields, the distant hills. This place must be heavy without him. The truth of that simple statement almost broke her. Her eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. She wiped them quickly, embarrassed. But Caleb didn't look away or judge her. He just stood there, present and patient, like the land itself. They had known each other long before she married Michael. They had grown up in the same small town, shared classes, shared chores at church events. And once, long ago, they had shared something close to a promise. But life had taken them in different directions. Caleb left the town for work, drifting from ranch to ranch, always moving, always searching. Caroline stayed, and in time, she met Michael, a kind man, who offered her a life of stability and love. Seeing Caleb now stirred old memories she had not touched in years. Memories that were warm, but also complicated. Yet, in her grief, she did not have the strength to examine them closely. "Can I help?" Caleb asked softly. "With the ranch? With the animals? With anything?" Caroline hesitated. She wanted to say no, to tell him she could manage, that she didn't need anyone. But the truth was painful, she did need help. She needed someone who understood ranch life. Someone strong enough to carry things she could not. And deep down, she needed someone who would simply stand beside her, even in silence. She nodded slowly. Yes, I think I could use some help." Caleb gave a small, gentle nod, the kind that said he would do whatever was needed, No questions asked. He set his hat back on his head and walked toward the barn with her. Both of them quiet as they moved through the familiar pathways. The animals sensed the change in the air. The horses whinnied softly, nudging Caroline as if they could feel her sadness. Caleb worked beside her, his movements steady and reliable, and for the first time since Michael's passing, she felt her breathing ease just a little. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in soft orange and rose colors, Caroline stood outside the barn and looked across the fields. The light shimmered on the grass, and for a moment, she imagined Michael standing there, smiling at her the way he used to. The ache in her heart grew heavy, but she didn't collapse under it. Not this time. Caleb stood a few steps behind her, respectfully giving her space. She heard him speak softly, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "You're not alone, Caroline." "Not anymore." She didn't answer. She simply closed her eyes and let the cool evening breeze wash over her. She knew the days ahead would be hard. She knew grief was not something she could outrun or cover with work. But with Caleb there, someone who knew her past, who understood the land, who moved quietly and spoke gently, she felt a small spark of strength return. The ranch still felt big. The house still felt quiet. And her heart still felt broken. But now, someone familiar was standing in the empty space beside her. Someone who had come back at the moment she needed help the most. And even though she didn't fully understand why his return mattered so much, she felt that her journey through the storm had just begun, and she wouldn't be facing it alone. Caleb Riker's return to the Mercer Ranch felt almost unreal to him. Years had passed since he last drove down that long dirt road. Years since he last saw the old wooden fence, the familiar windmill, or the warm lights shining through the kitchen window. Life had taken him far away, and his travels across different ranches had kept him moving constantly. Yet now, standing once again on the land where so many memories lived, he felt something shift inside him, something he had pushed down long ago. He hadn't planned to stay. When he heard about Michael's passing, he told himself he would come to pay his respects and leave again. But the moment he saw Caroline's face, tired, pale, full of quiet pain, he knew leaving wouldn't be so easy. There was something in her expression that made him wish he could take even a small part of her burden away. Caroline, too, felt a strange mixture of comfort and uncertainty with his presence. She had not expected him to return. She had not imagined he would stand in her barn again, moving with the same steady confidence she remembered from years before. But as the days began to unfold, she found herself silently grateful for his help. She didn't say much about her feelings, and Caleb didn't press her. Instead, he let his actions speak for him. Each morning, before the sun fully rose, Caleb was already outside, feeding the animals, checking the fences, and preparing the ranch for another long day. The sound of his boots on the dirt path became familiar to Caroline, almost comforting. When she stepped outside with her coffee, she often caught him glancing in her direction, giving her a small nod, as though reminding her that she didn't have to face the day alone. Caroline, in return, tried her best to keep herself busy. The quiet hours were the hardest, the moments when the house felt too still, or when she reached for something only to realize Michael was not there to help. She often found herself drifting through each room, touching small things he once used, and then quickly pulling her hand away as the memories grew too heavy. One afternoon, as she stood in the barn brushing down one of the horses, she heard Caleb's footsteps behind her. They were slow, unhurried, almost gentle. He didn't say anything at first. He waited till she finished the brushstroke and set the brush aside. "You're doing better today," he finally said. She gave him a faint smile. "Some days are softer than others." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "That's how healing works, I guess. It comes in small steps." Caroline looked at him for a moment, studying the lines on his face. There were new ones, signs of years spent under the sun, of long days and longer nights. But his eyes were still the same, steady, sincere, and quietly protective. They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, fixing a loose gate and preparing food for the animals. Their conversation stayed simple. They talked about the weather, the crops, and the neighboring ranches. But underneath those simple subjects ran something deeper, an unspoken understanding that neither of them felt ready to name. In the late evening, after the chores were done, Caroline and Caleb walked toward the field, where the tall grass swayed in the soft wind. The sunset had painted the sky in orange and lavender shades. Caroline paused, watching the horizon as the colors faded slowly. This was his favorite time of day, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He always said the land looks kinder at sunset. Caleb stepped beside her, but kept a respectful distance. Michael had a good heart, he said gently. Everyone knew that. Caroline closed her eyes for a moment. It still feels like he's here. Like I'll turn around and see him walking toward me, with that calm smile of his. Caleb swallowed softly. He didn't know what to say that wouldn't deepen her pain. So he let her speak at her own pace. I keep trying to be strong, she continued. I keep telling myself to move, to keep working, to keep living. But every time I take a step forward, I feel like I'm leaving him behind. You're not leaving him, Caleb said after a moment. You're carrying him. In your thoughts, in the things you do, in the choices you make. He's still with you, just in a different way. His words touched something inside her. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away this time. She let it fall freely, as if she was finally allowing herself to feel without hiding. Caleb didn't reach for her or try to comfort her physically. He simply stood there, quietly supporting her with his presence. Caroline appreciated that more than he knew. The next day came warm and bright, bringing with it a fresh wave of responsibilities. Ranch life did not pause for grief. There were animals to feed, water tanks to check, and fields to tend. Caleb worked hard, moving with the kind of natural rhythm that came from years of experience. Caroline watched him sometimes from a distance, noticing how easily he fit back into the land he had once called home. It's like you never left, she said one morning as they fixed a broken fence post. He chuckled softly. Some things stay with you, no matter how far you travel. Love. Caroline brushed dirt from her hands and looked at him more closely. Why did you leave? She asked carefully. It was a question she had never asked before. Caleb's smile faded a little. He leaned against the fence, staring at the hills. I guess I was looking for something. I didn't know what back then. I just felt restless, like the world was calling me somewhere else. Did you find what you were looking for? She asked. Caleb paused for a long moment before answering. No, not really. His voice carried a quiet sadness, one Caroline felt deep inside. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the hidden story behind his tired eyes. But she didn't push him. She knew everyone carried their own wounds, their own regrets. As the days passed, they fell into a soft, steady rhythm. Caleb took on the heavier tasks, so Caroline could focus on smaller, manageable chores. Sometimes, they shared lunch under the shade of the old oak tree. Sometimes, they worked in silence for hours. The peaceful kind of silence that didn't feel empty. But the more time they spent together, the more Caroline felt something she didn't expect, something confusing, something she tried not to look at too closely. It wasn't joy, exactly. It wasn't love, either. It was simply a warm awareness of Caleb's presence, a comfort she hadn't felt since Michael's passing. She wasn't sure if that warmth was welcome. She wasn't sure if it was right, and she certainly wasn't sure what Caleb felt, if he felt anything at all. One evening, as they finished putting away tools, Caleb spoke quietly. I'll stay as long as you need me, Caroline. I won't leave until you're ready. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw sincerity in his eyes. Something deep and steady. Something honest. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't think I could do this alone." "You're stronger than you think," he replied softly. "But you don't have to be strong by yourself." Caroline felt tears welling again. But this time, they didn't come from grief alone. They came from relief, from knowing she wasn't facing her broken world, all by herself. The sun dipped behind the fields, leaving a gentle glow in the sky. Caleb picked up his hat and headed toward the barn, giving her space once more. And as she watched him walk away, Caroline felt something shift inside her, a quiet, fragile hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Part 3 began with a quiet morning, one so calm that even the wind seemed to pause. Caroline woke early, but instead of feeling rested, she felt strangely heavy inside. Some days after a loss felt gentler, but other days felt like carrying a whole world on her shoulders. Today was one of the heavier ones. She moved through the kitchen slowly, touching the table, the counter, the window frame, as if grounding herself with each step. Caleb had already left for the barn like he always did, giving her space in the mornings because he sensed she needed time alone. He never asked for details. He never pushed. He simply helped in the way he knew how. But today, something inside her felt unsettled. Memories kept coming back in painful flashes, the sound of Michael's laughter, the way he held the reins of his horse, the warm strength of his presence beside her. It was as if the world around her kept reminding her of everything she had lost, piece by piece, moment by moment. She stepped outside and took a long breath of the cool morning air. The ranch looked peaceful. The golden grass, the soft hills, the gentle sound of animals waking. But inside her, a different kind of storm brewed, one she had been trying to quiet for days. Across the field, she saw the tall wooden cross standing near the place where Michael had passed. Friends had helped her set it there, decorating it with small wildflowers and tying a simple rope around it to keep the flowers from blowing away. She rarely went near it, unless she had to. It hurt too much. It felt too final. But today, something about the cross called to her. Maybe it was because she felt weak. Maybe it was because she needed to release everything she had been holding inside. Or maybe the weight of grief finally became too heavy to carry quietly. She started walking toward it. The grass brushed gently against her legs as she moved. Every step felt slow and thoughtful. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, steady at first, then quicker as she came closer. The closer she came to the cross, the tighter her throat felt. From the barn, Caleb noticed her walking and paused mid-task. He watched her small figure moving across the field, her shoulders slightly trembling even from a distance. He set down the tools quietly, wiped his hands on his jeans, and followed her path slowly, carefully, giving her space, but staying near enough in case she needed someone. Caroline reached the cross and stopped. The sight of it made her chest tighten painfully. She touched the wooden surface with trembling fingers, feeling the rough texture beneath her skin. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers tied to the post, their petals swaying gently. For a moment, she stood still, trying to breathe. But as the memories swept through her again, memories of love, partnership, and years shared, her strength shattered. Her knees bent, and she slowly lowered herself to the ground, letting her grief rise like a tide she could no longer control. The tears she had held back for days began to fall freely. "I'm trying," she whispered to the cross, her voice shaking. "I'm trying so hard." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with both hands. The world around her blurred as her tears flowed. She cried for the life she had lost, for the dreams that would never be, for the silence in her home, and for the deep loneliness that burned inside her. Behind her, Caleb stopped a few steps away. He didn't want to intrude. For a long moment, he simply stood there, watching her with a heart full of concern and quiet empathy. He knew she needed this moment. He also knew she shouldn't suffer through it alone. After a minute, he took a small step closer. "Caroline," he said softly. She didn't look up. She couldn't. Her sobs had taken over, shaking her shoulders. Caleb hesitated, choosing his next step carefully. He came closer, lowering himself onto one knee beside her, but still giving her enough space not to feel overwhelmed. "I'm here," he said in a tone that felt like a warm blanket. She shook her head slightly, still crying. "I can't do this, Caleb. I thought I could, but I can't. Everything feels too big, too empty." Her words cracked with raw emotion. Caleb placed his hand gently, not firmly, not forcefully on her shoulder, just enough to let her know she wasn't alone, just enough to anchor her to something steady. "You don't have to do it alone," he whispered. "No one should have to carry this kind of pain by themselves." She leaned slightly toward the comfort he offered, not because she was seeking anything more than support, but because grief had weakened her to the point where she needed someone steady beside her. Her tears fell faster as the weight she had been holding finally began to release. "It hurts so much," she said, her voice breaking. "Every morning I wake up and remember he's gone. I tell myself to be strong, but I'm so tired. I'm tired of pretending everything is fine." Caleb let her cry, not saying anything unnecessary. He knew that when a person breaks, what they need most isn't answers but presence. Quiet, dependable presence. After a while, when her breathing eased a little, Caleb spoke again. "You're allowed to feel this. You're allowed to fall apart. It doesn't make you weak." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, but kept her gaze lowered. "I feel lost," she admitted. "I don't know who I am without him." Caleb looked out at the horizon before answering. "You're still you, Caroline. You're still strong, caring, smart, and good. You didn't lose who you are. You just lost someone you loved. That kind of loss would shake anyone." She took a shaky breath. "Sometimes I'm scared I won't know how to move forward." "Then we'll take it one day at a time," Caleb said softly. "One sunrise. One chore. One quiet moment." She finally turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes red and tired. "Why do you care so much?" she asked honestly. "You could have stayed away. You didn't have to come back." Caleb looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Because you matter," he said gently. "Because Michael mattered to me, and because there was a time when your happiness mattered to me more than I ever said out loud." The wind blew lightly between them. It was not a confession of romance. It was a confession of history, of old, unspoken feelings that had never been acted upon, but had never completely disappeared either. Caroline's eyes softened. Not in a romantic way, but in a human one. A way that said she understood the depth of what he had shared. The weight in her chest eased just a little. They stayed at the cross for a long time. Caroline leaned back on her palms, breathing slowly as her tears dried. Caleb sat beside her silently, letting the gentle breeze fill the space between them. Eventually, she spoke again. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here, for not leaving." "I'm not going anywhere," Caleb replied quietly. The sun began to lower behind the hills, casting a warm glow across the field. The shadows stretched long and soft, wrapping the land in peaceful evening light. Caroline stood slowly, brushing the grass from her clothes. Caleb rose beside her, ready if she needed support. She walked up to the cross one more time, laying her hand gently on the wood. "I'll keep going," she said softly, "even if it's slow, even if it hurts." Caleb nodded. "That's all anyone can do." Together, they began walking back toward the house. Their steps were slow, steady, and side by side two people carrying different kinds of pain, but moving forward together. And for the first time since her loss, Caroline felt a small spark of strength return to her heart. Part 4 began in the quiet after Caroline's emotional moment at the cross. The next few days felt different. Still heavy, still painful, but no longer locked inside her chest. Something had opened. Something had softened. And although her grief was still strong, it no longer felt as silent or as lonely. Caroline moved through her daily tasks with a calmer mind. She still cried sometimes, especially in the early mornings when the world felt too still. But she no longer tried to hide her emotions from Caleb. He had seen her at her lowest. She no longer felt embarrassed to let him see her sadness. But even with this new sense of openness, she couldn't ignore the confusing feeling growing inside her. It wasn't anything dramatic or romantic. It was simply the quiet awareness of Caleb where he stood, how he worked, how his presence seemed to steady the air around her. She noticed the way he watched over her without being overbearing. The way he always kept just enough distance to make her feel respected. Not crowded. Caleb, too, couldn't deny the shift. He found himself glancing at Caroline more often, not in admiration or desire, but in concern and quiet affection, an affection that had lived inside him for years and had never fully faded. But he kept his feelings buried deep, honoring her grief above anything else. One warm afternoon, Caroline decided to clean out the storage shed behind the barn. It was full of old tools, blankets, and boxes, some belonging to her and some that had been Michael's for years. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, gathering her courage. Sorting through anything connected to her husband felt like walking into a fragile memory. She lifted a box off the shelf, opened it slowly, and found one of Michael's old notebooks. Inside were sketches of the ranch, fencing plans, lists of supplies, and simple reminders he had written for himself. Her heart throbbed as she ran her fingers across his handwriting. She didn't hear Caleb approach until he gently cleared his throat at the door. "You okay in here?" he asked softly. Caroline nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Just going through some things. I didn't expect it to feel this hard. Going through some five. I didn't." Caleb stepped closer, but only by a little. Memories have a way of feeling heavier than we expect. She looked up at him then. "Do you ever regret anything, Caleb? I mean, choices you made?" He paused, surprised by the question. He leaned lightly against the doorframe, thinking. "Yeah," he admitted honestly. "More than I talk about." Caroline closed the notebook gently. "Like what?" Caleb took a slow breath. "Leaving this town too soon. Not saying things I should have said. Not staying when maybe I should have. His eyes met hers, and there was quiet meaning in his gaze. Caroline felt a soft pressure in her chest, not a romantic spark, but a deep emotional clarity. She had always known there was history between them. Something unspoken, but hearing him say it aloud made the truth settle inside her. "I didn't know you felt that way," she whispered. "I didn't know how to tell you back then," Caleb said quietly. "You had your life, and I kept drifting. I didn't have a place to offer you." Caroline's voice softened. "And now?" He looked out toward the open field. "Now I'm older, and I've realized some places only show their value when you've been gone too long." She understood. He wasn't talking about the land. He wasn't talking about the ranch. He was talking about her. But he hadn't said anything inappropriate. He hadn't crossed any lines. He was simply being honest about his past, his mistakes, his regrets, his heart. The shed felt warm and quiet around them. Caroline sighed softly. "I feel guilty sometimes," she admitted. "Not because I've moved on, because I haven't, but because your presence brings me some kind of peace. And part of me wonders if that's wrong." Caleb shook his head gently. "Feeling comfort isn't wrong. It doesn't betray anyone. It just means you're human. And it means that maybe, just maybe, you're healing." Tears slipped down her cheeks at his kindness. "I don't want to depend on you," she whispered. "You don't," Caleb said gently. "You're stronger than you think. I'm just here to help you, until you can stand steady again." Caroline wiped her eyes slowly. She wasn't sure why his words made her feel both lighter and heavier at the same time. She realized she had been afraid of relying too much on him, afraid of crossing emotional lines. But Caleb had never made her feel pressured or confused. He had only offered stability. Later that evening, the two of them sat outside on the back porch. The sky was painted with soft blue and pale gold. Fireflies blinked gently across the fields. The quiet between them felt peaceful. Not awkward. "Do you ever think life gives second chances?" Caroline asked suddenly. Caleb smiled faintly. "I think it gives moments. Small ones. And what we do with those moments decides everything." She nodded thoughtfully. "I sometimes wonder if God sends people back into our lives for a reason." Caleb's voice was soft. "Maybe he does." A small breeze moved through the air, carrying the smell of fresh grass. Caroline rested her hands in her lap. "I'm scared, Caleb." She admitted a confession she hadn't spoken to anyone else. "I'm scared of the future. Scared of facing everything alone. Scared of forgetting. Scared of remembering too much." Caleb's eyes softened with deep understanding. "You don't have to decide everything right now. Healing isn't a race." She looked at him, grateful for the calm he brought into her storm. "I'm thankful you're here," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "I don't think I've said that properly. But I am." Caleb lowered his gaze modestly. "You don't owe me thanks. I wanted to be here. Not for any reason except that you needed someone." Silence settled between them, warm and gentle. Then, after a long while, Caleb spoke again. "Caroline, there's something I need to say." She looked up with cautious eyes. "I don't want you to feel responsible for my feelings from the past," he said calmly. "I'm not here to take any place in your life. I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm only here because I care about you, because you're in pain, and because it felt wrong to stay away." Caroline felt a knot loosen inside her chest. He continued in the same gentle tone. "You're grieving someone you loved deeply, and nothing I feel changes that. I respect your heart, your memories, your journey." Tears filled her eyes again. But they weren't tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of relief. Relief that Caleb understood her boundaries, her fears, and her emotional state without needing to be told. "And if someday," Caleb added carefully, "your path leads somewhere new, that's your choice, not something I expect. I just want you to heal." Caroline swallowed hard. "You're a good man, Caleb." He gave a small smile. "I'm just trying to do right." She felt her heart gently settle, like a piece falling into place. For the first time since Michael's passing, she didn't feel guilty for appreciating someone else's kindness. She didn't feel wrong for feeling safe beside him. They talked until the stars appeared overhead. They shared stories, not romantic ones, but stories of their past, their youth, their regrets, and their hopes. Their conversation felt like two old souls finding understanding in a world that had taken much from both of them. As the night deepened, Caroline felt something shift again. Not a romantic spark, not a sudden transformation, but a deep emotional clarity. She did not have to face the future alone. She did not have to fear every step. Someone was walking beside her, not to replace her past, but to support her present. And in the soft glow of evening, the two of them sat together, two lives touched by loss, but slowly learning how to breathe again. The days that followed were slow, quiet, and strangely peaceful for Caroline. After the long months of sadness and confusion, life on the ranch finally started to feel steady again. Every morning, the sun rose gently over the hills, touching the grass with soft gold. The cows moved slowly across the field, and the wind carried the sound of birds from the trees. Caroline woke up each day with a feeling she had not felt in a long time, something close to calm. Caleb continued helping her on the ranch, never rushing her, never pushing her to make any decisions. He showed up early each morning, sometimes with a toolbox, sometimes with a bucket of feed, and sometimes with nothing but a warm smile. He always asked her how she slept, and he always listened carefully when she answered. He never tried to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Instead, he let the silence be a place where both of them could breathe. Caroline noticed small changes in herself. She no longer avoided the barn where she used to work with her husband. She no longer felt afraid to walk past the fields where she had once stood crying. She could look at the ranch without feeling the sharp pain that used to rise in her chest. It didn't mean she stopped missing him. It only meant that she was learning how to carry that love without letting it break her. Every day brought new tasks. Some were small, like fixing a loose fence board or checking the water troughs. Others were harder, like repairing the old shed that had nearly collapsed in the last storm. But with each task, Caroline and Caleb found a rhythm. They worked side by side without needing to explain every move. Sometimes they talked about the ranch. Sometimes they shared simple memories. And sometimes they talked about nothing at all. Yet somehow, those quiet moments felt just as meaningful. One afternoon, after repairing a gate, they sat down beneath the wide shade of an old oak tree. The air was warm, but the shade kept them cool. The leaves rustled gently above their heads. Caroline watched a hawk glide through the sky and felt a strange sense of gratitude. As if life was giving her small gifts she had been too tired to notice before. Caleb leaned back against the tree trunk. "You've come a long way," he said softly. Caroline looked at him, surprised. "Have I?" He nodded. "When I first came back, you barely looked up. You were carrying everything at once. Now, you look lighter." She didn't answer right away. She thought about her husband, about the years they spent together, about the good days and the hard days. She thought about the night she cried beneath the cross and the confusion she felt, and she thought about Caleb, how he had shown up with patience, not with answers. "I'm trying," she finally whispered. "Some days, I feel strong. Some days, I feel like I'm still learning how to stand." "That's all right," Caleb replied. "Standing doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest." Caroline smiled at his words. She realized that, for the first time, she didn't feel guilty for smiling. She didn't feel wrong for enjoying the company of another person. Her heart was still tender, but it was no longer broken. As the weeks passed, the ranch grew healthier and more alive. Grass returned to the patches of dirt that had once looked tired. The horses seemed more energetic. Even the farmhouse felt warmer. Caroline spent time cleaning out rooms, opening windows, and letting the sunlight in. One day, she opened the door to her husband's old workshop, a place she had avoided for so long. She touched the tools on the wall and remembered how carefully he had kept everything. Instead of crying, she smiled softly. She whispered a quiet thank you and closed the door gently, feeling no fear. Caleb noticed the changes too, though he didn't say much. He didn't want to crowd her feelings or interrupt her healing. He simply supported her in whatever way she needed. If she needed space, he gave it to her. If she needed help, he offered it quietly. If she needed to talk, he listened without judgment. And if she needed silence, he stayed beside her without filling the air. Late one evening, when the sun was low and the sky was turning shades of pink and orange, Caroline asked Caleb to walk with her. She didn't say where they were going, but he followed without question. They crossed the field, passed the old fence, and walked along the path lined with tall grass. The wind carried the sweet smell of summer. After a few minutes, they reached the small wooden cross, the place where her husband had been remembered. It had been months since she last stood there. The weather had faded the wood slightly, but the cross still stood tall, simple, and meaningful. Wildflowers grew around its base, as if nature had wrapped it in gentle colors. Caroline stood still for a moment. Her hands were calm. Her breathing was steady. Caleb kept a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude on a place that belonged to her heart. She stepped closer to the cross and placed her hand gently on the wood, She whispered something softly, a message only she and her memories could understand. Then she turned around. Her eyes were not filled with tears. Instead, they held a quiet strength, a strength she had earned through months of learning, healing, and facing truths she once feared. "I think I'm ready," she said. Caleb's voice was gentle. "Ready for what?" "For whatever comes next," she replied. "I'm not trying to replace anything. I'm not trying to forget. I'm just ready to live again. And I don't want to walk forward alone." Caleb took a slow breath, his expression filled with warmth and understanding. "You won't have to. Not if you don't want to." Caroline stepped closer to him. She didn't reach for him in desperation or confusion like she had once done. This time, she reached for him with clarity, with calm, with a heart that had taken time to rest. Caleb lightly held her hand. The touch was simple, gentle, and filled with quiet promise. They stood together beneath the fading sky, letting the evening breeze surround them. There were no grand declarations, no hurried decisions, just two people who had found their way through pain and discovered the courage to continue side by side. As they walked back toward the ranch, the world around them seemed softer. The fields shimmered in the last light of the day. The farmhouse windows glowed warmly. The distant sound of a horse echoed through the air. Caroline felt hope rising inside her, steady and warm. She knew the road ahead would not always be smooth. Healing was not a straight path. But she also knew that she had rebuilt herself, piece by piece. She had learned to honor her past, without letting it hold her down. She had learned to let in new light without feeling fear. And she had found someone who understood her, not someone to fill an empty space, but someone who respected her journey. When they reached the porch, Caroline paused. She looked out over the land she had once feared she could not manage alone. Now she saw it as a place of new beginnings. A place she could rebuild. A place where memories and new chapters could exist together. Caleb stood quietly beside her, waiting for her to speak. "We'll take it slow," she said softly. "As slow as you need," he replied. Caroline nodded, feeling peace settle over her. The night sky stretched wide above them, filled with countless stars. The ranch felt alive again, and for the first time in a long time, her heart felt steady. She knew she wasn't replacing the love she lost. She was honoring it by allowing herself to live again. And with Caleb's steady presence beside her, she knew she wouldn't have to face the future alone. The journey ahead was still unfolding, but she was ready to rebuild, ready to hope, and ready to step forward into a new season of her life with strength, honesty, and quiet courage.